I alluded to something, now I'm following through. The card game genre is really weird. For as well known as the big hitters are, it's usually not for the gameplay. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is fondly remembered for the characters in the animated show, while Pokemon and Magic are notorious for the collectability and market. But through all that, some of us still enjoy playing the game that the cards were printed for. So let's get into what goes into playing a card game. In terms of gameplay and skill expression, of course. Card game skill can be broken down into 3 aspects: deck building, execution, and variance. First up, deck building. Card games are all about cards, collecting them, and their synergies. Before you head into battle, you need to be prepared. The preparation in this case being a well-built deck. In a genre where you already don't have constant access to all of your options, you can only bring a limited amount of cards into each game. It's up to the player to understand what strategy is the best, how much consistency is needed for the deck to run properly, and what to play to counter other strategies. A big part of card games is collecting a vast collection of cards, and it's up to the player to pick out the best out of all of them, the cards that work together the best, and utilize them to win. Players who spend time and effort testing which lists are just slightly better than others have an advantage. And they should. They put the work in. The next aspect, execution. You can bring the best, most finely tuned, perfect list to a match, but if you have no idea how to pilot it, you probably won't beat someone who knows what they're doing. As funny as the joke is, decks don't play themselves, and a player is tested on how well they can execute the decks they play. This means knowing the combos, seeing the lines to victory, adapting to different scenarios, and being able to outplay the person across from you. Players should be rewarded for the hours of playtime they put in mastering these decks. It's not just about bringing the right cards, it's about knowing what to do with them. And finally, variance. For better or worse, luck is built into the genre. You don't get to have access to all cards at all times, which is why card advantage and draw is so important. And the player going first, something very impactful, is determined by chance. The game will have an aspect of luck. It's something that players understand going into these games, and it's part of the fun. So playing around or playing with the variance is a skill, but it pains me to admit that some part of the game is just out of your control.
Variance! Unlucky.
And that's okay. Games can be skill intensive while also relying on luck. Those are the 3 aspects that I would say encompass skill expression. Big disclaimer, this is something I just kind of made up and is very broad. That's all. Each card game has a different pie chart of these 3 aspects. Some games have more emphasis on deck building, some games have more emphasis on execution, and some games feel really rooted in variance. But the optimal spread for these should be an equal amount in deck building and execution, with a low amount of variance. Enough that it's there, but not enough to dissuade competitive players from investing time into the game. And you want the deck building to matter in order to encourage players to really build decks that are their own, and not rely entirely on net decking. There are solid arguments for each game having this perfect distribution, but I think one game hits these percentages really well. And that game is Pokemon. Not the trading card game, the video game. Okay, hear me out. I know this is controversial, and I know I prefaced this with card game talk, but I think Pokemon has all the key aspects of a card game. It even has some additional benefits. For clarity, I'm gonna be mainly talking about the singles game mode, because that's the one I'm most familiar with, but I'm pretty sure most of this applies to doubles as well. I'm sure most people are familiar with Pokemon, but let's go through the gameplay quickly just to be sure. Each player has a team of 6, and they each send out one of their Pokemon at a time. Both players pick a move, or a switch, then the action resolves, and whoever knocks out all their opponent's Pokemon first wins. Simple as that. Now let's get into the hard part, convincing all of y'all that this can be viewed as a card game. In most card games, you bring a deck of cards, and in Pokemon, instead of a deck, you bring a team. You choose 6 different Pokemon, and that's your deck. But if that were it, I wouldn't be making this comparison. Each Pokemon has a potential 4 move slots, an item slot, and a choice of ability. With just these options, it's as if you're building a 42 card deck. And this isn't counting the deck building decision of effort values, natures, and all these potential choices. And just like in a card game, the moves, abilities, and items all synergize with one another. Pair a physically defensive Pokemon with a specially defensive one. Pair a Pokemon susceptible to Stealth Rocks with a Rapid Spinner or Heavy Duty Boots. My point is, these work together the same way these work together. Building a team in Pokemon is very similar to constructing a deck in a traditional card game. On to the next similarity. A critical aspect of card gameplay, the lack of access to all your options. In traditional card games, you can only play the cards that you draw, that you have access to. And in Pokemon, you only have access to a maximum of 9 options. The 4 moves you bring, and the option to switch to each of the 5 Pokemon you don't currently have out. And the longer the game goes on, the less options you have access to each turn. But in order to access the other 20 moves that you put on your team, all you have to do is switch Pokemon. Kind of like spending your turn drawing an additional card. It isn't exactly the same as spending resources on card advantage, but I think the spirit is there. Importantly, the game is also turn-based, but both players take their turn at the same time. Instead of taking your turn, waiting for your opponent, you both get to make your decisions at the same time, meaning there's less overall downtime. And finally, card games are built on the backbone of variance. So where's the variance in Pokemon? It isn't in card draw, it's a bit more subtle. Not all moves are guaranteed to hit. That doesn't feel good, I know, but neither does opening a handful of nothing. Moves also have a random chance to proc additional effects, and all damage calculations go off a 80% to 100% roll. A Hyper Beam could do anywhere from 80 to 100 damage, with the exact same situation being present. And finally, critical hits. There always, not always, is a chance for an attack to be a crit, and do more damage than normal. I'd say that's enough variance to classify it as a card game. Now that I've hopefully convinced you that this game does belong in this category, let's examine how it fits into the pie chart. First off, let's go a bit deeper into deck building. Making sure your team is well prepared is very important in Pokemon. If you don't have answers for everything that your opponent brings, you could end up losing the game on the spot. Was your team not built to stop sticky webs? There might not be too much you could do. You need to make sure your team has an effective balanced strategy, along with making sure your team can deal with the threats the metagame is presenting. And because there isn't the variance of card draw, a poor matchup is generally more punishing. And because of how unconstrained team building is, a losing matchup isn't usually due to an unlucky matchup in the metagame. Your team could have just been put together better. There are obvious exceptions. Something else that is specific to Pokemon, you have to make sure your numbers are allocated the right way, and hit the right breakpoints. It takes a lot of meta-analysis and testing in order to craft the perfect team, so I would say that deck building is important in Pokemon. Next up is execution. Do teams play themselves, and how much does the skill of the player piloting the team affect the outcome? In this aspect, I would argue, no, the team does not play itself. Because you aren't limited by your resources or card draw, there are a lot of options, and a lot of ways for you to misplay, but also a lot of opportunity to outplay your opponent. Teams do have a general strategy going into battle, but what you have to do in each game changes drastically due to the matchup and your opponent's team. Players need to read their opponent, to a degree, and understand and play into their unique win condition each game, and they need to adapt to the different scenarios that populate every single game. A game of Pokemon is very execution intensive, with some players even choosing to play with random teams, and still the best players end up on top. Even in a format where deck building is completely eliminated, execution alone can carry the game. Enough for there to be an active player base. Execution is important. So those are the first two parts. Pokemon places great importance on deck building and great importance on execution. So we get to the third point, variance. But not too much variance. The best part about the variance in Pokemon is that you can go out of your way to avoid it. You can choose moves that have 100% accuracy, and moves which have secondary effects that you don't need to rely on. It won't matter how the damage rolls go if you guarantee beforehand that even an 80% low roll can still secure the knockout. But that doesn't mean that variance doesn't exist or can even be completely eliminated. Crits are always going to be part of the game, most of the time, not always. And sometimes the additional effect is so absurd you have to use it, or your other less luck-based options are so much worse that you need to take the move with odds of missing. So variance will be in the game, but you do have a degree of control with it, which helps keep the game competitive. That's me trying to convince you why the game is good with the criteria I arbitrarily set for it. Now, some assorted things that I think make the game good. Games don't feel very curve-stony, which means it doesn't feel like you're doing the same things every game on each different turn. Playing a 1-drop on 1, 2-drop on 2, a 3-drop on 3, that's what I mean. Sure, there are leads and openings, but the situations end up so varied from game to game that something like that doesn't happen enough for too much repetition and the game playing itself to be a common issue. Another common issue of card games and formats is a lack of interaction and the lack of player agency. It doesn't feel good when it seems like your opponent is playing a single player game and you don't have any say in the outcome of the game. And it certainly doesn't feel good when it feels like there's nothing you as a player can do. This is something that I think Pokemon doesn't have that much of an issue with, because both players are taking their turns at the same time, and because you can only throw out one option per turn, you usually have something you can do. Sure, sometimes you get swept by an Arbok, but there was probably something you could have done better. The objective of the game is to knock out each of your opponent's Pokemon. This kind of forces you into interacting with your opponent's game pieces. Whether it be damaging them, debuffing them, or forcing them out, you have to interact with them at some point. Again, yes, there are exceptions, Dragon Dance does exist, but if you build your team well, you'll always have a way out of situations like these. Despite being turn-based, gameplay feels very fluid, and because it's so involved, it really doesn't feel like you're playing a single-player game. Every decision you make is impactful, managing risk-reward and doing everything to advance your way to victory. But I don't want to be disingenuous, so let's go over the downsides that Pokemon has. Although I would argue there is less variance in the game, I also do think that when variance occurs, it feels a lot worse to experience. Losing a game you should have won due to a random critical hit or a 90% move missing sticks with you. And it doesn't help that moves like Scald were too good not to use, and there was never any alternative for Focus Blast. This is a point that is a bit subjective though, so not everyone will feel this way, but I feel it would be wrong to leave out. And of course, the game does have frustrating Pokemon and frustrating strategies. My personal preferred format is Generation 7, and I really enjoy the format. I just really don't like one specific Pokemon that has been very popular since its inception in this generation. Take a guess in the comments, its name rhymes with Noxorex. And every game has frustrating strategies to play against. Magic has Control, the Pokemon trading card game has Item Lock, and Yu-Gi-Oh has whatever deck is winning in the meta. And Pokemon has Stall. The game is also purely digital, which means there isn't any secondary market value from your game pieces. This doesn't affect gameplay, but it's still worth being brought up. But that's enough negativity. The game isn't perfect and players accept it and play it anyway, but I did want to end on another positive note. The most important and biggest thing keeping players from getting into card games has nothing to do with the gameplay. It's the price. A good amount of people either aren't willing or aren't able to invest so much money just to play a game, and that's completely fair. So it ends up being really important for players to find a way to try out the game, or maybe even play it without needing the monetary investment. These games already ask you to put in a lot of time. It isn't fair that they ask you to put in a lot of money too. And in this respect, Pokemon has by far the most accessibility. For this whole video, I haven't been using footage from the actual games. That's because I've been playing on Pokemon Showdown, a free online battle simulator. If you want to play Pokemon, you can do so right now. No download, no paywall, everything is available. The client is a bit bare bones, but that's all you need. And it's all very organized. Ladders for past formats, weird alternative ways to play, and team builder helpers for players that just want to play. Other simulators like this do exist for other games, and some games have great online alternatives, and Showdown is in no way perfect. But in my opinion, Pokemon's is the best. I want to end this off by saying this is more of an opinion piece than most of my previous works, but I urge card game players to give Pokemon a try. And I think players who get put off by certain aspects in other card games may find enjoyment in this one, so just give it a look. I think it's pretty fun.